Honored to be here. Thank you so much. It's a Friday. I know that so many people have different things to do in this afternoon, but I'm super excited and I'm just very humble. And I was telling the Slow Factory team just how humbled I am to be here. And this is a subject that I almost feel like I have been digging into and uncovering for my entire life. And this book called Pretty Boys that I published in June, this is a culmination of my life's work. And so when it came out, it was a surreal moment. And I'm so honored and I'm just so excited to share the knowledge with you. Hopefully you find something of importance and something that can uplift you and perhaps make you feel less alone in this world. So why don't I start? I think this is a good time to start since we have participants coming in. Again, my name is David E. I am the co-founder of the gender-inclusive beauty brand called Good Light and the editor of Very Good Light, a beauty website redefining masculinity, and also the author of the nonfiction history book, Pretty Boys, Legendary Icons Who Redefine Beauty and How to Glow Up Too. This is a book about men, masc-identifying people, and their relation to beauty throughout history. It's proving that makeup and cosmetics has never been so gendered and inclusive for everyone. Today's lecture is Pretty Boys, the history of masculinity and makeup. And I really do want to show that makeup has always been powerful, uplifting, no matter the historical time you lived in, the place, or the culture. People from all backgrounds amplified their power through beauty. Let's get right into it. So what is the history of masculinity and makeup in a relationship? What does it say about us? What does it say about culture? And why is it in 2021 that everything changed, that things became so gendered? We're going to try to pinpoint that. We're going to try to dissect that in today's lecture. And I'm super excited to get into it. These are three of the most iconic figures that you see right now throughout history. We have Prince, we have Freddie Mercury, we have David Bowie, and these are just kind of modern day examples of pretty boys. So first of all, what is a pretty boy? In modern day semantics, a pretty boy is a word to describe a man or masc presenting person who is perceived as feminine or effeminate. I remember growing up when I was called a pretty boy, whether it was at church or whether it was at school, and it was a facetious term to embarrass me, right? To question my masculinity, to ensure that perhaps my agency was taken away. And I think that throughout time, when you called someone a pretty boy, when you called someone pretty, it usually meant that you wanted to take away their shine, their light, or to put them at a level that was less than you. And I think that for me, the term pretty boy, I wanted to bring back that term. I wanted to own that term again. I wanted to take back power and say, hey, being a pretty boy is pretty powerful. But throughout history, it's been a term used to take away that agency. In the 1920s, there was actually a bank robber named Pretty Boy Floyd. And it was a facetious term given to this, gentleman. And he said that he later resented it. And it was deliberately given to him to embarrass him in the media, in the newspapers, and say, yeah, he's this pretty boy and he's a bank robber. He is a little effeminate. And, throughout history, pretty has been used in a way that isn't uplifting. But in today's modern era, we're taking that back. And in this presentation today, we're going to understand why pretty is pretty powerful. And the last point I've made here is, pretty boy is also a term where it's, one party, usually in power, strips another of their dignity, their pride, and ultimately, like I said, their power. What was a pretty boy in history? If we know that pretty boys in our modern day era, the agency was taken away from them, what was a pretty boy in history? A person in power who asserted their command through their aesthetics. We're going to see through this presentation that kings to assassins to dignitaries to emperors, all used their aesthetics to amplify their power. It was also traditionally a person in power who would use makeup or cosmetics as a way to signal they were in control, they were godly, or they were ordained. And not only were they rulers, these were tastemakers, culture-pushing folks, people in different eras who were able to make a dent in history. And it wasn't always those who were officially in power, it was also by the people. And we'll see throughout this presentation just different examples of that. So aesthetics were used, I kind of break it down in 4 different ways throughout history. 1, politically, 2, socially, 3, economically, and then 4, religiously. So politically, we'll see this through figures like Pharaoh Ramses, the Black Panthers, Cyrus the Great, the Babylonians. Socially, the British macaroni, Little Richard, Chapeau, Neanderthal, Vikings. 3, economically, King Louis XIV, Max Factor, an entrepreneur, the Wodabe tribe and people. 4, religiously, the Hwarang of Korea, more specifically the Shilla dynasty, Ki Inchjana Pakal of the Mayan kingdom, and third gender peoples throughout the world. And we'll see that, throughout history and the book, there are so many other stories and examples, but there weren't enough pages. And I really do hope that we're able to uncover even more. Perhaps there'll be a second book, perhaps there'll be even more information coming out. But these are kind of main examples that easily kind of showcase these 4 different reasons why aesthetics were traditionally used throughout history. And I would like to say pretty has always been pretty powerful. And I don't know where you stand, but historically, coming from an objective kind of purview as a historian, I have found that throughout history of time, throughout the ages, one's aesthetic amplified one's power. And it was never seen as gendered. It was never seen as stigmatized. That's kind of a modern day phenomenon, but it was always considered something to amplify yourself. So I always like to say pretty has always been pretty powerful, and it still is. And here's a quote from the book. Centuries of heteronormative attitudes have minimized the close relationships men have always had with the ritual of beauty. To beat their foes, these men need to beat their faces. To snatch some wigs, these leaders need their own wigs snatched. For their legacies to grow, they needed to glow. So this is kind of, a play on words, yes, and it's a fun way. But the crux of what I'm trying to say is to further your kingdom or to further your purpose or your mission, one needed to amplify their beauty in order to do so. And that's my argument throughout Pretty Boys. So let's get into pretty political. These were kings, pharaohs, rulers, all who used aesthetics as a means of asserting power throughout the ages. This is Pharaoh Ramses II, and as we know, as Pharaoh Ramses the Great. And this was a pharaoh who was, one of the fiercest warriors throughout Egypt, one of the fiercest leaders throughout time, but he was a pretty boy. He amplified himself through his eyeliner, his kohl eyeliner, his beautiful wigs, his hairless body. So right before he awoke, the pharaoh would open his eyes to dozens of servants in his bedroom. There were nail filers, there were wig masters, they were folks who would do his makeup. They would dunk his body in milk to exfoliate. They would also use a process called sugaring to remove all hair from his body, because as a pharaoh, you were a living, breathing example of what a god was. So everyone believed that pharaohs were earthly gods. And as earthly gods, you had no hair, you had to be beautiful. And it was this very intense process. I don't know about you, but it would be exhausting for me to wake up and have 3 hours of pampering before I would go to the temples to, pay homage to the gods or to go to my daily duties as a pharaoh. But this process was very labor intensive, but it was also spiritual. And so we saw, servants or people with titles like, man who filed down the pharaoh's nails. And that was an official title that was on the tombs of some folks. And it was such a prestigious title to be able to file down a pharaoh's nails that it was forever plastered onto your tomb. It was something that you would take to the afterlife. You were touching a god every day, right? And so being in the presence of a pharaoh, being able to touch and do the makeup was something that was seen as sacred. And the pharaohs took this very seriously, as did many other people. But let's go into kohl eyeliner. It wasn't just any kohl eyeliner. It was mixed between kohl crushed with, emeralds and golds and silvers. And it was to amplify the power of the eyes, the all-seeing eyes. It was also to mimic what they believed gods looked like. And so if you wore kohl eyeliner, it signified a certain class. The color signified a certain class too. It was also used practically as a sunscreen to ward off kind of the sun and its UV glares, but also to ward off evil spirits. And it was also to be used so that insects wouldn't get into the eyes. This kohl eyeliner was a repellent as well. So it had its practical elements as well. Beauty has been a constant symbol of power. It has always been a conduit for change, like we talked about. We went over Pharaoh Ramses. Let's talk about Alexander the Great, who we know is one of the fiercest warriors throughout history. But Alexander the Great was also a pretty boy. He is a forefather of scents, as we know them today, obsessed with fragrance notes, and was able to transcend time and space through scent. So Alexander the Great was known to also be a leader who would take back kind of scent throughout his kingdoms that he conquered, and send it back to his home. And he would do this so that they would be able to bottle up these fragrances and be used to be used through his own self-care regimen, but also to be sold. And so he kind of created this entire industry of fragrances as well. Alexander the Great was known when he was younger to go around the palace and look for fragrances and scents and cabinets. And he was so obsessed with the fragrances that it was said in many texts that his clothing was fragrant, his breath was fragrant, everything about him. He was just an obsessive when it came to, different fragrances. And he would also have an official person on his in his army who would be there to bottle up different fragrances while they were traveling throughout the kingdoms. And so Alexander the Great was definitely, yes, a powerful and physically mighty person, but had that softer quality of relying on beauty to help transcend perhaps the pain that he was in or the time that he was in. And he understood that fragrances and that feeling of smelling was something that was equally as powerful. Cyrus the Great, this colonizer, was still considered to be noble throughout the texts. Yes, he would colonize different countries, but it was said that he would amplify, the people that he colonized into his own circle of trust. And so if he colonized a specific nation, he would try to find people there to be a part of his, his inner circle to create different laws in place so that the people it would be just. It would be something that everyone would feel good about. But he was also said to be a beautiful specimen, a beautiful human. Was considered the most beautiful leader and attended salons for hours where he would beautify through cosmetics or through different elixirs, potions, and serums. And also he was said to be this person who was obsessed with his clothing. So Cyrus the Great was also someone who is a pretty boy throughout history. And, a lot of different rulers looked up to him, like Thomas Jefferson, said that he was a great ruler to respect, but he was also someone who was a beauty obsessive. Let's talk about the Babylonians. They were fierce. Fun fact, nails were also important in most all cultures, but the Babylonians loved their nails and to beautify. In 3200 BCE, before the Common Era, In Babylonian warriors would spend hours at a salon, coloring their nails, curling their hair, painting their lips to match their eyes before even going onto the battlefield. I mean, think about just how important this is. Before your last day potentially on Earth, before you go and even wield your sword and shields, you are going to a salon as a warrior because you understand the importance of your aesthetics. And so these Babylonian warriors would go into a salon because they respected themselves so much, they wanted to show on the battlefield their best selves. And, I have this quote, no man of importance would permit himself to be seen in public unless he had been beautified. That's a report from, the Babylonian times. That is a purpose of why they beautified and were obsessed with their beauty before their potential last days. The Babylonians weren't the only ones who were obsessed with their nails. The Vikings had a nail kit next to their swords. Ming Dynasty warriors wore golden nail guards, mostly men. Chinese were, the first to create acrylic nails made of beeswax, egg whites, gelatin, rubber. So nails were always a sacred kind of part of, one's body. And it kind of had this sacred kind of undertone. I mean, think about the keratin in your nails. It's like hard. It's a hard spot on, a fleshy body. And so a lot of people thought that they were bones, or some others would collect them for the afterlife. Nails always kind of had this aura of sexiness as well. And so it's no secret that nails were just so sacred and seen as such throughout many kingdoms in the world. Let's go into the social aspect of beauty. So history makers were never quiet. They always made a deliberate statement with their aesthetics to push culture. This is a macaroni. So who is a macaroni? The macaroni in the 1700s were the influencers of their days. These were young people, probably in their late teens, early 20s, who came back from studying abroad. And places like, Italy or France, they adopted their styles. And when they came back home to Britain, their parents were frightened. This makes me laugh in so many ways because it reminds me of when I came home from college and I wore skinny jeans when, this was a time when people weren't wearing skinny jeans. And I colored my hair. And my dad would look at me and say, oh my goodness, where did my son go? And it's just really hilarious when you look at cartoons during this time. There's a cartoon of a father poking at his son's wig, a macaroni, and saying, what happened to my son? I'm so kind of shocked that you have this new appearance. And the macaroni, they certainly made a stir. Back in the 1700s, most British men were wearing periwig wigs, which were short, kind of not really chic wigs, more practical. But when the macaroni, these young people came back home, they adopted French wigs. These were larger than life wigs. Some would put a little cap on the top, but these were larger than life, powdered. Their faces had blush and powders and makeup, and their actual suits and their clothing were tighter fitting clothing. And this was adopted through Italy. So a lot of people were astonished by how these young British people were kind of countercultural, and they were signaling kind of this new era of aesthetics for men. You can see on these beauty patches, they were made of velvet. They hid pock marks. Smallpox was rampant during that time. And they were created to be chic. They're in shapes like hearts and moons, crescent moons and stars. And, these beauty boys in the macaroni, they really did amplify this trend, and men, women all kind of wore this together. But this was, kind of 100 years throughout Europe where the macaroni reigned supreme. They were so obsessed over, yes, there were lampoons and cartoons that poked fun at them, but they also were dedicated magazines for macaroni. There were plays that were based on macaroni. The macaroni were just the biggest influences. People were obsessed with them. Conservative older men hated them and despised them. We can see some homophobia and transphobia in texts that say they are its or they are animals. They should be expunged from society. People were afraid of this changing face of kind of what they believed a man could be. Now, why were the macaroni called the macaroni? It's because they came over from their studying abroad and they ate the noodle in question, the egg noodle in question, the macaroni. And because they did that, everyone thought it was very pretentious. And so they called them the macaroni facetiously, and it just caught on. I don't know if you remember that song from Yankee Doodle. Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his cap, and what? Called it macaroni. This was these men that song is referencing. And Americans were kind of poking fun at the macaroni as well and saying, we're just going to stick a feather in our cap and call it really chic, just like the macaroni. And so this is kind of poking fun again at the macaroni, even across, the Atlantic. They were, Americans were really privy to them as well. But they're powerful socially, pushed culture, and they went out of favor at the end of the 1700s, which we'll go over and why. Beauty is inherently rebellious, as we talked about, the macaroni to the Vikings, to Little Richard in more modern times. The Vikings were the fiercest of warriors. We know in texts that they stood over 6 feet. They were brawny, in many ancient texts shows just how beautiful they were. A lot of Anglo-Saxon women would fawn over these Vikings just by how aesthetically pleasing they looked. But they were also beauty obsessed, with their toolkits next to them and their beauty toolkits next to them, next to their swords and their shields. And on Saturdays, they called it Lordog. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, excuse me. Literally means an entire day of bathing, the day of bathing. Why was bathing such a big thing? And why is it that we're even bringing this up? Well, during that time, Anglo-Saxons viewed bathing and the act of bathing as being sacrilegious. You would have to disrobe. It was unchristian-like to be naked in front of people. And they also believed that to ward off, bacteria, viruses, you needed a layer of dirt on you to protect you. And so there's an interesting quote that I found from this time. It says, everyone stinks, no one smells. So if everyone kind of is putrid and doesn't bathe and you get used to that smell, then perhaps no one smells. Even queens and royals, like Queen Elizabeth II was said that she only bathed twice in her life. Once when she was born and the day before she was married. And so think about the Vikings then bathing once a week. This was considered as, whoa, this is highly unusual behavior. Why are they doing this? Well, the Vikings were obsessed with their beauty. They would tie their hair up so that, in battle, their hair wouldn't get bloody. That's just how obsessed they were. They had beauty toolkits, like I said, composed of ear picks. They had tweezers, custom-made brushes, one for their beard, one for their hair. And they had scissors for trimming. And again, like I said, these were beauty kits next to their swords and their shields. That's just how, how obsessed they were and how seriously they took this, the beautifying. There's also texts that say that they would dye their hair certain colors with lye. They would also, trim each other's hair and just ensure on that Saturday, it was this self-care practice of going to natural hot springs and for an entire day, beautifying. We already talked about the macaroni, who were fascinating and still super fascinating, proving that, Gen Z influencers or makeup gurus or influencers, they're not new. There were influencers back in the day. And let's talk about Little Richard. Little Richard is the architect of rock and roll. And this history maker wore pancake makeup for the first time on stage, big wigs as expression and as a way of acceptance with white audiences. So when Little Richard came about and he was on stage and he had this exuberant aura and this showmanship, he would later say in interviews that he started wearing makeup and being more, quote unquote, feminine because he wanted to be embraced by white audiences in America, so that white men wouldn't feel that their white women were attracted to Little Richard, and they it's impossible for them to, if there was a man who wore outlandish makeup and big wigs. And so he did this as a way to assuage kind of the egos of white men. And this is a tactic that he said that he deliberately used to amplify his power in pop culture. But Little Richard is so interesting and fascinating because he is the architect of rock and roll, as we know. So many, artists came after him musically that, kind of stole his sound from the Beatles to even Billie Holiday, to everyone. And even his clothing would inspire generations to come. Like Prince was very inspired by Little Richard. It was really interesting that pancake makeup was really never used on stage by men until Little Richard came along. And Little Richard kind of allowed the possibilities of, in the 50s and 60s for a rock star to look a certain way. And so culturally, this was a huge deal, especially as a Black man from the South, to have this new kind of idea of what masculinity could be. It was culture pushing, and it was immensely, immensely powerful. And I don't think Little Richard gets as much credit as is due, but he inspired so much. And I really do hope that we can look to Little Richard and remember him when we're talking about beauty today. The Neanderthals. So we'll talk about them later too, but the Neanderthals also wore makeup, and they ground up pyrite as a means of using highlighter expression. But they're also, really socially, they were people who would amplify their own power through the use of their aesthetics. So we see Neanderthals, for some of us, our ancient cousins, as being kind of these beings who perhaps were furry creatures, low-browed, and all they did was grunt and throw rocks together. But we're seeing that that was actually not true. So 50,000 years ago, these Neanderthal creatures were highly intelligent. And in a study, an excavation in the early 2000s by a University of Bristol professor named Professor Gilliau, he concluded that these Neanderthals actually wore makeup, irregardless of gender. In caves, they found seashells full of paint, which he concluded was foundation. He found this glittering kind of substance, which we now know as highlighter, that was ground up with sparkly different rocks like pyrite. And he said that these Neanderthals would showcase their beauty through a glittering effect, through that highlighter. So it's so fascinating that way before Kylie Jenner, way before, Fenty, there were the Neanderthals who were using foundation, and also they were using highlighters. And the archaeologists concluded that cavemen weren't just low-browed grunting creatures, rather that beauty and their instinct for wanting to beautify made them into intelligent beings with high IQs. So it's fascinating to me that perhaps this says that innately, even in humans, irregardless of gender, when we are born into this world, we want to be celebrated and we want to amplify our power through our aesthetics, or we just want to be seen and we want to be really seen for who we are, but perhaps even our aesthetics for what we look like. And I think that that was just super, super fascinating to look back in time 50,000 years ago. Can you believe, to Neanderthals who also beautified? We're going to talk about economics. Pretty as an economical tactic and tool. Beauty as a way of business. These men used beauty as a means of selling products or even themselves. We're going to talk about King Louis XIV first. This is King Louis XIV. This was a young king who started to lose his hair. And we don't know if it was genetic or because of syphilis, as young royals were wont to go out and have many flings with people throughout the kingdom. So we don't know why his hair was falling out, but his hair was falling out. So what do you do as a young king? Do you just go out in public without hair? Or Do you create a trend where you're going to start wearing wigs that are larger than life? And he started to do the latter. So before this, people were wearing, shorter wigs, like the pair of wigs that I was talking about. No one was wearing extravagant wigs. But it's kind of like the Regina George effect from Mean Girls, where, remember when Regina George cut out holes in her tank tops where her breasts were, and it became a trend. This was what King Louis XIV did. He was like, I'm going to start wearing heels because I'm like 5'2", and I'm going to wear big wigs to give me like 7 inches of height. And everyone else is going to do it because it's going to be cool. It became the biggest trend throughout Europe. He created a sensation. And the wigs were larger than life. They were 6 feet long, made of virgin hair. He had a wig maker, kind of like the Chris Appleton to the Kardashians at the time. And this wig maker would go into northern France and pay women to cover their hair throughout the year and grow it out so it wouldn't be damaged for these extravagant wigs. And it became such a trend that there are wig makers throughout France, even in the rural countryside. There were, in one area with a small population, it was said that there was like 19 wig makers in a city of like 100 people. And so it became a fantastical trend, one where the French country was able to capitalize and actually sell and export wigs. And King Louis XIV was the first to kind of create this luxurious industry before houses like Chanel, Dior, Louis Vuitton was the king who created this massive wig trend and started to really build France's economy just through wigs and just through aesthetics and luxury. So beauty as business, we also need to talk about the entrepreneur named Max Factor. As we know, Max Factor was kind of the first to kind of commercialize beauty products. He was a refugee who escaped Russia and created the first known makeup products, first in Hollywood and then the world. I mean, before this, can you imagine a time when you couldn't just go to a shop and get a foundation or a beauty tool? I mean, that seems very bleak, but that was the reality before Max Factor came along. Max Factor was a Jewish person in Russia. He was the royal family, the Tsarina's go-to makeup artist. And they kept him so busy that he was working around the clock. And so much so, they were surprised when they found out that he actually had a wife and children. And in the night one day, he escaped onto, a boat heading towards the US. He heard a rumor that Jews were being purged throughout Russia. And so he fled. He got on a boat, made it to America, where he then created, and commercialized beauty. And this is fascinating because before this, like I said, there was no kind of commercial offerings. It was only for royals, or it was really clumsy formulations. But Max Factor was the first. He actually created the pancake makeup that Little Richard used, and he made it into big business. Max Factor is still around today and is still thriving. The Wodabe tribe, these nomadic men use beauty to sell themselves. And in an annual pageant, they dress up in makeup. They really amplify their features, their hair, their teeth to become beautiful in hopes of getting married. And so in the Wodabe tribe, it's very fascinating because once a year, it'll be this week-long pageant where it's the men who are on display. And the focal point for these men are to, try to attract women. And women can also, they're in power, but they can also switch out their current husbands for a new one. So it's a big deal. So the more sexier you are, the more amplified your beauty power is, the more, I guess, the chances are that you'll be able to get married, or you'll be able to find a mate. If you're a woman, it's an exciting time because you can also trade out your husband for a new husband. So this is beauty as business and selling yourself, right? So selling who you are. And I think that even today, we, the Wodabe exists today, but what we can learn is that in our modern culture, we're always trying to sell ourselves. And I think that unknowingly or not, I think that we as human beings want to be embraced, and we want to sell who we are, and we hope that people will buy what we're trying to offer. Pretty religious. Beauty as a method of channeling a higher power. This is the Hwarang of the 600s. They were fascinating because they were these beautiful young men who were chosen for their beauty to join this assassinship. So Korea in that time was split into 3 different kingdoms. Shilla was one of the bigger of the kingdoms, but they were always under constant attack. So their ruler named King Jinhung, he thought that, before he died, he wanted to leave a legacy, but he wanted to know that the Shilla kingdom would survive long after his death. He was very spiritual. He believed that Maitreya was watching over the Shilla kingdom. Maitreya was a Buddhist god who was said to be the most beautiful of Buddhist gods, a pretty boy. And he believed that Maitreya's soul, when he died, was left in the ground, in the soil of the Shilla kingdom. And so whoever kind of was birthed to be a pretty boy had that Maitreya spirit in him. We can call this big Buddha energy, like I say in the book. But this big Buddha energy was said to be in the prettiest men throughout the kingdom. And so it's kind of interesting, like how Korea has, K-pop auditions and their scouts looking for pretty young men. King Jinhung was doing the same thing. He was like, if you're pretty, you must have this Buddhist energy. It must mean that you're ordained and you're going to be a fierce warrior. So the prettiest men throughout the land joined this assassinship called the Hwarang, which translates to flower boys, which means pretty boys. And they were trained in the arts, horseback riding, archery, swordsmanship, how to be a fierce warrior, but also how to wear makeup. Because makeup was seen as a way to become closer to Maitreya, these young men would amplify their power through beauty, through this spiritual act. And they were so beautiful that Chinese envoys actually, when they visited Shilla, would document, those Hwarang boys are just so beloved and so radiant and so beautiful. So we're seeing that even in other countries, they caused a stir from their beauty. So beauty as religion, we're talking about the Hwarang, we already talked about them. Kinch, Janab, Pakal, these were Mayans who worshipped corn, the corn god, and mimicked their aesthetics to follow suit. This is possibly the first example of body modification. Kinch, Janab, Pakal was one of the longest reigning kings in South America and Central America, in the Americas in general. And he was a king who wanted to resemble corn. And so he would elongate his head. He would file down his teeth so they looked like corn, and bejewel them too. Before we blinged out our grills, he was doing it with turquoise and different stones. But it was a beauty standard to be cross-eyed in the Mayan kingdom. And so when you were born as a child, because you wanted to resemble corn, your parents would put wooden headboards between your head so it would elongate. They would put a kind of toy in front of your face so that your eyes would cross. And if you were chosen, you were able to modify your teeth. And this was a way to mimic the gods, to amplify your power, to make sure that it was religiously sound. It might sound a little interesting for us today, but it really does prove that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and every culture has their own standard of beauty. Let's talk about the third gender folks. Third gender folks throughout the world were considered as sacred spiritual vessels, from the two-spirit of people of Native America to the Fa'afine of Polynesia. Third gender folks have always existed and thrived throughout time and history and locations. And I know that a lot of people may say, oh, non-binary, that's such a new concept. It was never a new concept. Non-binary folks always were very important members of their tribes and communities and have existed throughout time. And these were spiritual vessels who allowed people to see, magic, or to experience the afterlife, or to be caretakers in their tribes. Very crucial people in their communities. So what changed? And I know that we're running a little out of time, so I'm going to try to get through this as quick as I can. But what changed? If if you're asking David, okay, you're saying that men, masc-identifying folks, have always beautified, then why is it that today it's so different? We can turn to the gender binary. And it was created deliberately to separate people, and it was created for a quest for power for certain people. Let's go into the Enlightenment period, the scientific revolution. This was a time when everything changed. So let's talk about Europe, because the European lens is was and is the dominant lens of kind of which the world sees itself, just because of imperialism and colonization. So when it comes to the Western world, we're going to focus strictly on the Western world right now. So we know that the British macaroni thrived in the 1700s, but they came to a demise at the end of the 1700s when the Victorian era, which was the most boring of eras, took over. And this was a time when these European men, they amplified, reason, politics, fraternity, and science during this revolution, right? So during this time, they believed that to separate themselves from others, which are namely women, they needed to talk more about how they would take over in power. And these were the 4 subjects that they were obsessed with. So in 1797, the first female skeleton was published by Samuel Thomas von Sommering. And why was this so important? It was a vital moment because the skeleton proved that women were incapable. Women had smaller skulls, they had smaller bodies, so of course they had smaller brains. And so this was deliberately created by men so that they would separate themselves and say that they are uplifted as a more powerful species, and women were now incapable. So anything that was frivolous, right? When it comes to makeup, when it comes to dress, anything that didn't incorporate itself into science, reason, fraternity, it was considered as frivolous, considered now as feminine, and that was despised. That is why the macaroni went out of favor, because they were now considered as feminine. They were frivolous creatures who didn't really amplify anything into the scientific revolution, where they were trying to figure out the next wave of how they were going to live and exist in the future. So like I said, women had smaller anatomy, so of course they were more incapable, said men. Makeup was now frivolous, and if you were wearing makeup, you're now vilified. And reason, intellect, and freedom to think became known as masculine. And everything else, all other acts, were now considered as feminine. So then colonization, westernization occurred. And it's this pursuit to stamp a flag on foreign soil, became Europeans' obsession for this world conquest. Thus came the European standards of beauty, in turn also race culture, forced non-binary people in those situations to, conform, creating a more binary system. It created a westernized thought of beauty. It also kind of created so much chaos through this time. And it was amplified by the world wars. And the world wars really amplified the hyper masculinity and hyper femininity and the gender roles of men and women. So the world wars came about, and if we were getting to a gendered future, this really amplified it and solidified it and cemented it. This was a time when men were shipped off to war, and women, for the first time, were required to go into the workforce. This is in America. Let's focus on the Americas right now. So American women were now forced to go into manual labor jobs like factories or the postal services. And for the first time, they were kind of taking over these men's jobs. Now, the American government didn't want men abroad to feel as if they were being eclipsed, especially by women. And so they created this propaganda so that women were seen as, they're not taking over, but they're here as kind of cheerleaders in the interim. Look at how beautiful they are. We're just going to tell women that they need to amplify their femininity through makeup, their hair, through wearing pantyhose, so that we differentiate them from men and make sure that they're these objects instead of people. And so these brands like Brands like Elizabeth Arden created these campaigns that said, it's your duty to beautify. It is anti-American and non-patriotic to not be dressed up and not to wear lipstick and put your hair up. This is where the pinup girl became a thing. You know, men abroad wanted to look at women to feel inspired when they're fighting. And women in America were kind of required to be those pinup dolls. There were, you know, shades like Victory Red or Fighting Red lipstick in different shades. And this propaganda really lasted from World War I into World War II. And it was by and large successful, so successful that even in 2021, we still adhere to this propaganda. And this has the repercussions and effects that translate into our modern day era today. Beauty is very much gendered and along the binary. You know, hypermasculinity and hyperfemininity kind of won out in our Western culture. You know, when we look at even CVS today, it's hypermasculine grooming products, they're not beauty products in one section, and hyperfeminine cosmetics for women. And these are all remnants from World War I, World War II, and European influence that came from, you know, the scientific revolution, the age of reason. But this is kind of where the gender binary kind of began and why it's so solidified today. It has many notions of misogyny that we need to unpack. And it's a history of really making it so that men are in power and then anyone else is beneath. And it is a propaganda that we need to remember, and I think we need to uncover. And there's so much more history that we need to dig up. But for the sake of time, we'll conclude there. But identity is changing. The revolution is happening in so many different ways. We're kind of going back to our nascent selves. So it's because of Gen Z, rise of inclusivity, LGBTQIA, redefining masculinity. All these different forces are shaking what we think we know and we've been conditioned to feel as humans. So Gen Z, social media, they're a new demographic that's progressive and pushing culture and saying, hey, no, we can be whoever we want to be. Inclusivity is at the forefront now as folks are realizing intersectionality is key and people are coming into their own identities that they've always been. You know, the LGBTQIA community has always been the leaders when it comes to this identity revolution throughout history, and created aesthetics that are mimicked by people and that inspire people. And so we do need to give due credit to a lot of LGBTQIA, which in my book, there's so much more information that we can go over. And then redefining masculinity. You know, as work is now being created for men and masc-identifying folks to learn and unlearn their conditioning. And I think that whatever spectrum you're on, you cannot deny that masculinity is becoming more democratized. The biggest sex symbols today are bands like BTS, who are, you know, happen to wear makeup and have colorful hair. We have Bad Bunny, who wears acrylic nails or likes to dress up in drag. We have Harry Styles, who's a gender-bending, heartthrob. And I think that we're going to see even more of these figures becoming more thought leaders and trendsetters. I mean, look at Lil Nas X. Lil Nas X is crushing it right now when it comes to dismantling the gender binary and what masculinity can look like in today's day. So beauty beyond the binary, you know, I really want to hit home this point because that's the tagline for my beauty brand called Good Light. And we are beauty beyond the binary. We are a gender inclusive brand. We're trying to get back to our nascent self in history and really push this notion forward that, you know, we are all equal, that beauty has no gender identity. It is used by folks with gender identities to amplify who they are and who they've always wanted to be. But we need to also understand from this presentation that the gender binary and its roles and conditioning are all remnants of the 1700s, 1800s, amplified by propaganda from World War I and World War II. And we cannot forget that. I think that we are very forgetful people as the human race. But when we do our digging, we can understand why the gender binary exists and why it's kind of silly to still adhere to that. So here's to a gender non-conforming, gender non-binary, a more free future where we can just exist and be. And I hope that we can all understand that pretty has and will always be pretty powerful. Thank you, everyone. I hope that made sense. And I hope that you learned something from my presentation today.
Thank you so much, David. You've given all of us a lot to reflect on. I definitely learned so much from this class. And I find, one of the key takeaways, and it's kind of a common theme in our open education series, is how the kind of European Age of Enlightenment, followed by European colonialism, really changed the social and spiritual and gender landscape for so many people around the world who were impacted by colonialism. And I was so fascinated by how you described beautification, as being maybe even more in the realm of men and their expression of political and social and even spiritual power and a sort of seeking. And then after colonialism and the world wars, sort of morphing into becoming a tool of misogyny and in many ways, both a liberatory, but also a really oppressive tool used against women in a way. And now what I think I hear you saying is that Gen Z is pushing the pendulum back the other way.
Yes.
That's what you're saying. So I am so curious about, I want to hear a little bit more about how you see Gen Z subverting this like sort of trend of beauty being maybe a little bit more of an oppressive thing and really subverting it and making it into more of a tool of collective liberation, of gender nonconformity, of all of those things. Can you get into that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, Gen Z is the first generation that was by and large born virtually out of the womb with an iPhone in their hand. And so they are globalized by nature. They are really savvy when it comes to different identities because they are exposed to so much. And I think that idea of inclusion is kind of inherent in them now. And I think that they question everything. This is a generation that is going to question gender norms, sexual norms. This is a generation that is more sexually fluid than any generation before. And I think because they're empowered with understanding that the world isn't so microscopic, they go out of their way to try to be more educated on, why certain things are certain ways. And now because information is so easy, I mean, when I was growing up, we had encyclopedias or like discs that we had to, put into our computers, but the world is your oyster with Google and with your iPhone. You can come up with, you can get answers instantly. And because of that, I think that Gen Z is questioning everything. And because they question everything, they're pushing things and they're saying, hey, wait, that's not quite right. And why is it that you taught me this, but I'm actually finding information over here that is contrary to what you say? And because of that curiosity, I think that that's how that our culture right now is being formed and pushed.
Thank you. The chat has been extraordinarily active, and there are lots of questions in the Q&A box. So I have some questions on my own, but I'm going to wait until we get through questions from the students. This one I think is particularly important, especially because you talked quite a bit about the role of European colonization in the way that we perceive beautification practices. This comes from Jesslyn, and the question is, so many of the historic pretty boy tastemakers were actually horrible people when judged with contemporary ethics. These are kings who were investing in luxury when people, in their kingdoms were dying from a lack of resources, emperors taking time to beautify themselves or smell wonderful. It was a really interesting part of your talk, actually, before going out to colonize and enslave Viking or Babylonian warriors, ensuring that they were well groomed to then commit horrific acts of violence. How did that impact your research and writing on what is obviously a topic that brings you a lot of kind of joy and, obviously fascination and expression? How do you reconcile that, history and in your writing and also in your thinking about this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an amazing question. But as a historian, you have to go into what history says. I went by secondary and primary sources. And history is rarely beautiful, right? History is so ugly and complex, and there's so much to unpack. There's so much to unpack from a present day lens, but also thinking about, what they thought was right and virtuous during those times too. So as a historian and as a writer, you take these because you're human and because you really do care. But, history is rarely ever so just easy. And I think that when I was going into this, it was like, these are colonizers, right? When we talk about these leaders like Cyrus the Great, who's called Cyrus the Great, who colonized so many kingdoms, how do you disconnect that with, this idea of pretty boys and unpacking masculinity? Well, the thing is, you have to go in objectively and know, right? Going into these books and texts, you are going to be triggered. It is going to be difficult, but history is history. You can't change history, especially when you're going through primary and secondary sources. And so, throughout the book, I tried to make it as diverse as I could possibly do by finding sources from everywhere. But there's still so many different stories that I would want to put in the book that didn't make room. And I hope that maybe there'll be a Pretty Boys, a sequel. But as a historian, I think you need to really understand that, history is from a certain vantage point and also question that as well. But know that you're limited in your resources and you're not a physical time traveler to actually go back to see the real truth, but to really just go by the information you have at hand.
Thank you. Here's a related question. How have Black and dark-skinned folks been at the forefront of the movement to decolonize and degender makeup and beauty?
Well, I can say from an American standpoint, we can look at the first drag queen in America who was a once enslaved person. And that was someone named William Dorsey Swann. He was a dark-skinned Black man who challenged the norms of heteronormativity in the 1800s, right? This was something that he was incarcerated for. This was something that he fought for. He wore dresses in public. He created these cakewalk parties where people would come over and they would judge, these drag walks, and whoever won a cake. That's why it's called the cakewalk. And so much of our culture in America has been, when I say culture, I say beauty, or when I say trends, or when I say, aesthetics, it comes from Black people. And, folks who are marginalized usually find a way to have the biggest impact on, the greater culture. So when you ask, how have Black and dark-skinned folks been at the forefront, this is just one example in history when the most marginalized sometimes and oftentimes have the biggest impact on a society, and also with global culture. I mean, I would say William Dorsey Swann, hopefully there'll be a movie based off of his life, but we can find so much inspiration that happened in the 1800s because of him.
Well, picking up that thread and maybe, bringing it into the now. Here's another question. Someone is curious to hear your thoughts on celebrities like A$AP Rocky, who is so ingrained in the fashion world and goes by Pretty Boy Flacco and is turning the tide for pretty boy energy.
I love that so much. I love that there are modern day figures who are saying, hey, like, maybe I was called pretty all my life, but A$AP Rocky's like, I am. So what? This is me, and I'm powerfully so. And I think that he is also turning that facetious term pretty boys on its head and saying, yeah, I am pretty, so what? And that makes me really amazing and amplified and elevated. And I think that that's something that we all need to learn from, and that energy. I want every person around the world to have that energy to say, hey, I'm powerful in my femininity. I'm also powerful in my masculinity. I have that yin and that yang, the divineness of both. And he's really amplifying and exemplifying that.
I feel like this term that you said earlier in your talk is like ringing and reverberating in my head. It was big Buddha energy, I think you said, in describing the use of beautification and makeup by Korean men who wanted to use it to experience a kind of spiritual closeness to Maitreya, who is the Buddha to be born, right?
Maitreya was a Buddha that was born, and in a way, like Jesus was coming back to earth. People who believed in Maitreya believed Maitreya was going to come back to earth in the final days.
Okay, yes. So, of course, also as a fellow Korean American, I'm so curious to know if you found anything in the whole historical records to describe actually what those Korean men did makeup wise. What did they what did they actually accentuate, or what did they apply? What did it look like?
So I say in my book that there isn't, direct text from Koreans on what the beauty was like, but the Koreans during the time were an envoy in the Shilla dynasty, at least, with the Chinese Tang dynasty. But the Tang dynasty says that certain, elixirs were used or makeup processes were used, like peach blossoms or safflower, and we can see through that. And I say in the book, right, there's no direct kind of primary source of what these hwarang used, but we could indirectly assume that because they were so culturally inspired by the Tang, the Chinese, that they perhaps used many cosmetics that the Chinese used during the time too. And so I would say that it was this porcelain, white powder and foundation, blush, red eyeshadow, and very much hydrated hair. That was kind of the trend during the day.
Hydrated hair, I love that.
Hydrated hair.
Yes, hydrated hair.
With a nice sheen.
We, when we were sort of posting on our Instagram that your class was coming up, we have a quote from you on the post that says beauty is inherently rebellious. And one of our students wants to parse that out. What do you mean by beauty being inherently rebellious, especially in the context of some of these figures you described who seem to be more in positions of power? So in what context would you say beauty is inherently rebellious?
Yeah, I would say that beauty triggers something within people, whether you are born into a society, transcending time and experience. Beauty is a means for people to always talk about you, or to fear you, or to see you as a certain person. And when I say, beauty is inherently rebellious, I think that innately we all want to be seen. Sometimes we're afraid to do that. But when we step into that light and we allow others to then celebrate who we are, I think that's a rebellious act, because stepping into your power is always fearful to most folks. Stepping into your authenticity, going against the norms of society, especially in our modern era, that's an act of rebellion. And I think that, beauty is not just what you put on your exterior. I think that beauty means that authenticity and also your true self shining into the real world. And sometimes that takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of boldness. You have to be really brave, and you need to really step into your own. And doing that really takes time and energy. And I feel that for most folks, it's very difficult to do. But beauty isn't just about what you wear on your face or your outer appearance. It's also about the rebellion that you want the world to see from the inside out.
Would you say in that respect that beauty as an act of rebellion is maybe something that applies more to male identifying folks? Because I mean, I'm sort of thinking about the expectation of beautification that is placed on women and women identifying people, that, you know, it doesn't necessarily always feel liberatory.
Are you talking about in the context of modern day or throughout history?
Modern.
Yeah, I mean, I think that beauty has been so normalized because of, history and, propaganda today. And beauty has also been oppressive in so many ways to femme identifying or women. But in today's day, I do still think that there's a stigma attached to men, masc identifying folks who wear makeup. I think that we'd be very ignorant to say, oh, anyone can wear makeup, when still in small populations or big areas like New York or LA, a man or masc identifying person who wears makeup is seen as other, or is an act that is so outrageous that people cannot imagine that that person can be human or seen as human. So definitely it's an act of rebellion still to this day. I hope that we can all work to, normalize beauty and normalize expression so that everyone can feel safe to be who they are from the inside out.
That's interesting because you mentioned earlier, BTS and the role of other men in K-pop in kind of normalizing makeup for men. And I haven't spent time in Korea in a couple of decades, actually. So I'm just wondering, how is it perceived there? Is it completely pervasive where, men are wearing makeup and there's no stigma attached to it? Or what is the general perception there?
It's interesting because I think when you go to Korea, beauty is kind of, it sees gender as irregardless. And I think it has to do with Confucianism. Confucianism says that if you respect yourself so much, you'll respect others by presenting yourself in your best light, right? And so that means pampering yourself, making sure that everything's in place, that your hair's in place, that your face is nice and dewy and moisturized. And so I think that when it comes to makeup, it's still not really a part of that gender binary like it is in the Western world. When I went to Korea in 2017, it was fascinating to see army men going into subways with an Innisfree bag full of sheet masks and beauty products. And it wasn't stigmatized. It's something that they're like, of course, as you would brush your hair and brush your teeth, you would also put on moisture on your face or care for your aesthetics. And when it comes to K-pop, the industry of K-pop, which I do write about, in the early 90s was created by this man named Lee Soo-man from the agency called SM. He created the first K-pop group called HOT. And he did so by the female gaze, right? So K-pop is by and large created and made for the female gaze, where I think in the Western world, it's still the male gaze. But he actually went out and surveyed for 2 years college-age girls and high school-age girls and asked them what they wanted in the perfect idol. And they all said, we want them to look softer. We want a softer expression. And so that trickled down decades later. And that's why we see, K-pop being so embraced by the cosmetics industry, or K-pop stars embracing their aesthetics. It's because K-pop is viewed through a female gaze instead of a male gaze.
Wow, that's super interesting. Okay, I'm going to now go a little bit deeper into the Korean beautification practice, right? So you're saying it's been sort of opened up as a realm, that the realm of beautification has been opened up to men because is being seen through kind of a female gaze. I read pretty recently that now the vast majority of young people, I would say younger millennials and even Gen Z people in Korea, have gone far beyond just makeup, but now they're all getting cosmetic surgery. Not all, but like something like 80% or 90%. And so much so that getting like the eyelid surgery, nose bridge surgery, and shaving the jaw is now called something like the basics. And I am curious about where you stand on, you know, surgical beautification and the intense pressure that seems to have developed in South Korea for young people to conform to this very, very narrow, and in my sort of gaze from here, European white conforming beauty standard of like, you know, sort of a narrow perky nose with a high bridge and a sort of triangle shaped face and like big round eyes. So people are now spending thousands of dollars and going under the knife to take this, you know, beautification to the next level. And you know, does that make you uncomfortable? Do you have a feeling about that? What is actually happening here?
I have many thoughts when it comes to this. From a Western purview and Western privilege, I don't want to say from my American vantage point, what a society should and shouldn't do. When it comes to Korea, it's by and large a homogenous country where mostly everyone looks like you, has the same education as you, probably has the same kind of abilities as you do. What is that unfair advantage in this hyper-competitive culture where it's virtually impossible to get a job at, you know, Samsung or Hyundai, these big corporations? The one unfair advantage you think you have is your aesthetics. Because this East Asian culture is really is very Confucianist in this idea, like I said, that unfair advantage becomes your aesthetics, right? And I think it's a very, I mean, we need to dispel this myth. Korean people don't want to look white. No one's going into a plastic surgeon's office and saying, I want to look like Angelina Jolie. No, when it comes to double eyelid surgery, the actual history of that comes from a Japanese ophthalmologist in the 1800s who created the double eyelid surgery so that Japanese people could look more Japanese because half the population already naturally has a crease. And so when you go into South Korea too, or Southeast Asia, half the population already has that crease, right? And so when it comes to Korea, how that became popularized is there's an actress in the 1990s, which I write in my book. She had that double eyelids, she had a high nose bridge, and she created this trend. Before that, my mom's generation, she told me that her monolids, I have monolids, monolided eyes were actually the trend before the 1980s. It was only after this woman that became kind of more trendy to look more like her. When it comes to the pressures of plastic surgery, I'm not going to say that, oh, this is the demise of a culture. I'm going to say that that is what a culture believes in, and that's what certain people do to amplify their own inner power, to feel more like themselves, or to feel, you know, as if they are more confident in themselves. And I'm not going to say that plastic surgery is a bad thing. I'm not going to say it's a good thing. I'm going to say it's a thing for many people. And it's also nothing new. We see that in the Mayan kingdom, so many people went through body modifications so that they could look a certain way. And I'm not going to judge a population by what they decide to do with their bodies, especially when I'm not, you know, from that population. But I do want to dispel the myth that Asian people want to look European. That is not the case.
Thank you so much. I learned something new because I, you know, I'm not an expert on this topic. I haven't delved into it. And I did not realize that the double eyelid surgery was invented by
a Japanese
ophthalmologist,
in the 1800s.
Wow.
There's also a myth, I do want to say this quickly. I've seen this on social media, that Koreans started the double eyelid surgery because it was the Western princesses, they're facetiously called, Korean sex workers during the Korean War got double eyelid surgery to look more westernized so that white military men would then, you know, not only pay for their services, but perhaps, you know, bring them to America. that is not a trend that started from these sex workers, because for one, sex workers are still stigmatized in Korea. So why would they be able to be the ones with the agency to create a larger cultural trend? But two, this happened way before the 1950s. It was happening in the 1800s where people were getting this eyelid surgery because half the population already had double eyelids. Double eyelid surgery, isn't to make your eyes rounder. Even when you go to a plastic surgery in Korea, they're not going to just make the eyes rounder. They're also going to cut the corner so you also have that nice almond Asian shape, right? That when you go to a plastic surgeon's office, because they want to look more East Asian. And I want to dispel all those myths that Asian people do not want to look European. They are proudly who they are, and they want to look more Korean. And I think that, we also need to understand that Korean standards of beauty, we can't just judge a population. We need to really understand and be from that population. So I just wanted to say that. Who's the actress? Someone asked. Yes. I believe her name, I'm going to look at this really quickly in my book because it's in my book. I think it's on page 184. I will get this answer for you because it is important. Yes, it is. The ophthalmologist's name is Kotaro Mikamo in 1886. And the Korean actress's name is Hwang Shin-hye.
And you said that the actress was in the 1980s. Is that right? And that was when it became mainstream in Korea.
And before that, monolids, like my monolids, were more trendy.
And then how early was it pervasive in Japan?
It was started in 1886 from this ophthalmologist, and it became, more of a, he's the one who actually created that procedure. But I think it became more pervasive in probably the latter part of the 1990s.
And now, is it used widely across other East Asian countries? China is still in Japan as well.
Also in Southeast Asian countries too, because of the influence of Korea. But Southeast Asians naturally also have double eyelids. East Asians naturally also have double eyelids. Double eyelid surgery isn't, just to make you look different. A big portion of the population already has double eyelids.
I think there's one more question in the Q&A that we didn't get to yet, and I want to make sure that if you have just a couple more minutes to answer.
Yeah, my hard stop was 5 minutes ago, but I could quickly go through this question.
Okay, it's really just about that men wore makeup in history, wore makeup to mimic the gods and goddesses. Do you think it's because men in power wanted to, I guess, increase their power by representing themselves as closer to godlike?
Yes. So we see this through populations like the pharaohs who saw, gods looking a certain way. And so that's why they amplified their power through their kohl eyeliner, because the eyes were so powerful. So absolutely, when it comes to makeup and mimicking gods, goddesses, that was a big part of many populations to look to, the gods to be kind of their guiding star and their North Star on how they're supposed to look in the earthly realm.
Thank you so much. And thank you for staying a little bit extra and for going overtime. I think that judging from the chat, people have been really fascinated by all of the historical research that you presented today. I know I definitely learned something about beautification in Korea. I really, really appreciate it. And for all of you who were able to join us today, please check out David's work and his book and also his social media accounts. Would you mind just dropping those in the chat so people know where to find you? They are also tagged on our own Instagram post about today's class. And as always, a lot of work goes into producing these classes, into curating them, into finding teachers like David, into making sure we have accessibility, interpretation, and recapping the classes afterward. And most of all, making sure that we keep the classes free. So if you are in a position to support us financially, please, please, please become a monthly donor so that we can keep these classes free and accessible to everyone. Any amount is deeply meaningful for us, and it's just a way for us to grow our community. Open education, the open education movement is always powered by the people. So thank you so much, David.
Thank you. I do want to say something really important in the end.
Yeah.
This book is just a starting point. Pretty Boys is just a starting point for you on your own personal research. This isn't the history of every person in history. There's so many more folks that I wanted to really highlight and still do, work on. But when it also comes to history, not everything is so finite. We're relying on, primary, secondary sources that we don't know if they're completely true either. But that's what we're working with as historians, right? And so I want everyone to take a grain of salt with everything that they read in history or they interpret, that everything in history, even from thousands of years ago to now, we need to understand that perhaps there are, different interpretations and what have you, but this is my interpretation.
Yeah, it's always good to remind ourselves that history is usually the account is told by the victors, right? Or
Right.
dominant class. So thank you for that reminder, and always looking at everything we read and research with that lens.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Day.
Have a great weekend.
Bye. Thank you, Antonio. Thank you, Jeremy.